to tell each other our stories. We need to show that everyone, our neighbors, our families, our community leaders, everyone we know is touched by corruption. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is anti-corruption and the need for systemic change in Sri Lanka. Joining us this evening on the show are Lasil De Silva, former Director at Administration, Sri Lankan Parliament, as well as a former Secretary of Presidency. Also joining us this evening on the show is Dhananath Fernando, CEO of Advocata Institute, Dr. Pakis Sudhisaramuthu, Executive Director of the Centre for Policy Alternatives, as well as Sankita Gunratna, Attorney at Law, Deputy Executive Director, Transparency International Sri Lanka. To pose questions from our panelists tonight, on to my immediate right is Niresh Edethambi, Consultant Director at Newsfirst, as well as Nadeem Majid, who is a freelance journalist. You too can join in as far as the conversation is concerned. The number to WhatsApp your messages is 076 656 5353. The number once again, 076 656 5353. So let's get the ball rolling today with Lasil De Silva, former Director Administration Parliament, as well as former Secretary of Presidency, which is the Presidential Commission of Inquiry to investigate and inquire into serious acts of fraud, corruption and abuse of power, state resources and privileges. Such a long name, and nothing has been done so far. On the 3rd of June 2018, a report was submitted to President Maithripala Sirisena as well. We are talking about corruption. You were the former secretary of this organization. What has been done? Absolutely nothing. The time starts now.
Yeah, actually in 2015, let me start that way. It was a mandate given to the then government, headed by Maithripala Sirisena, the then president. I'm happy I was appointed secretary, and within a very short period we did everything what was possible, and there was a generally an accepted, people thought only sprats will be caught, not the sharks. In our case, it was the first commission. Actually, I would say we were very proud because initially.
Proud of what?
Proud of what we have been doing. And for the first time, the president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and quite a large number of cabinet ministers, because there were serious allegations. And all of them were brought in, and the investigations were going on. We had to do our duty because that was a mandate given to the people, by the people. And as a committed, government servant, I was also there, and there was excellent members of the commission. All of us did our job. You asked me what happened, and nothing done. True. I know quite a lot of money was spent, but I would like to say we had done our part. I think it may be also pertinent to say that there was pressure to change the course of action, but I never wanted to change.
Are you a lawyer?
No, I'm not a lawyer, actually.
So you must be well aware that until proven guilty, everyone in the eyes of the law is innocent. So you're mentioning names of Mahinda Rajapaksa.
No. I said there were allegations against them, right? When there were allegations, it was our duty. That was the terms of reference given to us, and I don't accuse in that way, but
there can be allegations to Mr. De Silva.
No, that is why a commission was appointed for.
So what did the commission do?
We did our part, and the investigations were going on. Finally, I was thrown out. Probably because they were under the impression that end of the day they will be whatever sent to, the due process will be followed, and ultimately they'll end up in.
Tell me a few cases that you were investigating at that time.
That Mahinda Rajapaksa, there were these allegations against, expenses with regard to ITN. They had advertised all that for the elections, and the bills were not paid. Then the former President Gotabaya, what is this security, whatever, they have been used for campaign purposes and all that, and Sri Lankan Airlines, quite a number, you know.
So people are leveling an allegation at committees of this nature as well, Ms. De Silva. Why? Because they say that if you all did your job right in 2015 when you all got a mandate to have a good governance structure in the country, none of this would have happened. 2019, Gotabaya Rajapaksa wouldn't have been able to contest the elections. There wouldn't be economic mismanagement. Everything would have been okay as far as the country is concerned. But look at what happened. You're
right.
talking about
You're right.
anti-corruption, you're talking about big words. All these are buzzwords. We've heard this enough.
True, I agree.
What have you all done?
Even in my case, I
Absolutely
endorse
nothing.
all what you say. The problem is, if the politicians don't have the political will, what can the public officers do? Right? I mean, this is a long story. We might even have to take up another day. Unless you do the state reforms, you will never be able to. Public servants.
Right.
Let me say it this way. I want to say this. Now, Abraham Lincoln had said, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. I would say this must go on record. Government of the politicians, by the politicians, for the politicians. So that's the difference, you know.
So, Mr. Sir, one final question before I move to Dhananath. You speak about the will of the people, will of politicians, all that and more. But I don't know whether you remember 2019 when you all fielded a presidential candidate, Mahesh Ranage. He was not even able to get 50,000 votes.
That's not his
at
fault.
the presidential election.
That was not his fault.
Do you think the people want change at this point of time? Because they didn't want change in 2019, that's for sure.
They wanted a change. They wanted a change.
Do they want a change now?
They wanted the change in 2019.
50,000 votes.
I felt, yeah.
50,000 votes, they wanted
No. People wanted, you're referring to people.
Yeah.
People wanted the change. And probably they got the change. And they experienced what the change was. We were talking about something more, something better.
So you think Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who had allegations against him, would have been able to stay the country in 2019?
I did say that he was
You just
able
mentioned.
No. I mean, people wanted Gotabaya. Right? People elected him. It's not within our control, you know.
Right. Thank you very much. Leslie De Silva, former Director, Administration, Parliament, as well as the former Secretary of Presifac. I now move my attention towards Dhananath Fernando, CEO of Advocata Institute. Dhananath, we're talking about corruption over and over again. I remember you coming on the show and saying, we have to put a stop for corruption if the country is to develop. Why are we still talking about corruption?
I think the question is twofold, Shamir. Of course, nothing has happened. But when we look at the overall system, I see there are two elements. One is the people's element. The second thing is the system element. We are looking at people appointing honest people who can basically carry out those mandate and basically put people who are corrupted behind the bars. That's one side. But also to get the people who can put the corrupt people behind the bars, that process is also need to be strengthened. So it has to go hand in hand. And unfortunately, in my view, corruption in certain cases is a byproduct, or like it's an output of a massive policy issue on the other side. For an example, if you get the sugar scam, even if you go to courts, I do not think that you can be proven that it was a scam. We all know it's a scam because it was done in the legal, given the mandate to the Minister of Trade, because he can basically change the tariff overnight. He can bring it down overnight based on his discretion. So when you have that sort of a room in the legal system, it's very difficult to corner someone, because in a way that corruption is institutionalized. So that's a system issue. But now the question is, how are we going to bring someone who can change that system? Because we all know that incentivizes the politicians and their campaigns and all that. I think now the time has come that we should ask ourselves, we all know the political will could have done it, but we all know the politicians do not have the will to do it. So then we have to ask the question, what we should do to get the will, or if without their will, how can we do it within the legal framework? I think that's the question. So in that sense, that's where I think the civil society organizations, journalists has to come together and set that framework also to bring the correct people into power, and also once they are in power, also get that system that can mandate that getting the right people in.
So Dharanath, right after the IMF came to Sri Lanka's rescue, they brought in a framework which needed to be adhered to, and one of the frameworks really capitalized on making sure that there was no corruption in the country. But look at what the revelations that were being made recently, even in Parliament. Parliamentarian Party Champika Ranaka went on to say that billions of rupees have been swindled from the people's essentials. We saw the health crisis that took place in the country. Then you mentioned about the sugar scam and all that and more. So things are happening even now. Can that be stomached by the people? Because we're talking about this year being an election year as well. How important is that for the public and also for the IMF to look at moving forward?
Definitely not. Even when the IMF representative met the civil society organizations, that was one request. Because IMF at this moment have a lever with the government, because that tranche or that money is required to continuation of the debt restructuring. So whether that implementation of the IMF governance report recommendations, and also the civil society has done another extensive report. So whether that can be made in a way, sort of a conditionality to get that, to proceed with the IMF agreement. So definitely the people cannot digest this level of corruption, but the challenge is, again, it's, I think, institutionalized. And it has been institutionalized for a reason, that is to benefit, we all know the obvious culprits. But I think what we need to fight for is basically to change that system element as well as that people element together. And I think without that, we will be speaking the same problem in years' time.
Very quickly, I'm going to ask you a few open-ended questions. I need a yes or a no to before I move to Dr. Sara. Are you satisfied with the country's economy?
No.
Is Ranil Wickremesinghe going to be the next president of the country who can make that change as far as the country is concerned?
I would like to skip that question. I mean, but I can. I don't have a yes or a no answer.
A yes or a no would be ideal.
No, I think it's a program. As I mentioned, there's a people's element and a system element. I more would like to look at the process and the system. The reforms hasn't been done.
So is Sajid Premadasa a good option for the country?
I think the program, whoever the leader, the program is what matters. Because without the state-owned enterprises reforms, without those anti-corruption laws, who comes, the name doesn't matter.
Sanaki is not the option.
The name doesn't matter. The action is what is going to matter, Shamil.
Thank you very much, Dharanath Fernandes, CEO of Adukara Institute. I now move my attention towards Dr. Pakeswara Saranamuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives. Dr. Sara, Dharanath also went on to say the importance of the civil society at this point of time. How do you view the role of the civil society in an election year, and also when you're talking about corruption?
Well, as I've said many times, and I think on this show as well, I think the role of civil society is setting the agenda. Civil society is not there to grab political power. What civil society is there to do is to set the agenda of reform. And I think that's what civil society needs to concentrate on, both in terms of constitutional reforms, in terms of economic reforms, the governance reforms, all of that. And I think what we need to do is to get our act together fast, because perhaps we don't have enough time in terms of the impending presidential election, for example, to come up with a list of reforms, in effect, a civil society manifesto, which we should get the political parties to subscribe to. Subscribe to in whole, And if they can't, in part. But I think they should subscribe to it in whole and commit themselves to implementing those reforms. Once they get into power, we have to continue to be vigilant to ensure that they do implement those reforms. But I would like to say one other thing. I mean, you know, politicians are not a different breed. They come from society. They don't fall from the skies or crawl up from under a stone. They're us. And we have to recognize our responsibility in terms of the crisis that we have. And with regard to corruption, for example, there is a long, prolonged debate, an unresolved one. Is it institutions or is it political culture? And what are the dynamics between the two? You know, is it political culture in terms of what the people want and what they expect and their attitudes? Or is it making laws, good laws, which then the political culture has to take on and implement? And I think that is a major problem that we have in terms of the implementation. And one last thing as well. You know, politicians, yes, in Sri Lanka, we all recognize them to be corrupt. However, going after them, we have to recognize that our social contract is in complete shambles, and we cannot go after them without observing the rule of law. So we have to have evidence that will stand up in court to prosecute and convict them. I think that's very important. There are allegations all over. You and I might think that X and Y is corrupt, but we don't have the hard evidence. But if the state is going to do this, it needs to have that hard evidence. The rule of law needs to be observed. And one other point just outside of that, you know, politicians, particularly members of parliament, we also need to look at what they spend their money on and as to whether they are given a salary that is appropriate to the demands of their electorates. Because after all, at the end of the day, every birth, every wedding, every funeral, they're expected to pay, either in whole or in part. Where do they get that money from? And the very last one, talking about civil society and corruption, you know, I always think of this as the best example. We have a public education system which has a 2.5-mile limit in terms of admission to those schools. Every parent wants to send their child to the best ones because the public school system, all schools are not equal. Instead of naming the schools, I think you'll know which ones they are. How many of them actually live within that 2.5-mile limit? And if you think of other schools located elsewhere in the city of Colombo, if the 2.5-mile limit was there, they would be very different. Very different.
Dr. Sarah, you said about setting the agenda, and you said that's the role of the civil society. But during the Aragala in 2022, we saw the people setting the agenda for the country. They want a systemic change. Do you see that systemic change happening in the country, or at least unfolding gradually, step by step, coming to an election year?
I think the Aragala achieved one thing. That was to get the Rajapaksas out of government. With regard to this whole system change thing, I've had 101 different versions of what this system change was supposed to be. For example, I was told that at night in the Aragala in Golfest there is to be terrific debates whether one should abolish the executive presidency. And some even came to blows. Now, what I'm trying to say to you is this. The Aragala was flat. It didn't have one single leadership. Therefore, it didn't have a single program. It could only talk about it in slogans. And so system change has become a buzzword. Ask people what they mean by system change. Ask them, and you'll find 101 different versions. So you have to, if you are doing this, okay, the Aragala was probably spontaneous. But if you are really talking about an agenda of reform, you need to think about it and get a consensus with regard to what it is and come out with it in generalities, but also some specifics as well.
Dr. Sarah, very quickly, before I move on to Sankita, you said that the people wanted the Rajapaksas out of the governance structure, but we see now Basil Rajapaksa is back in the saddle.
Out of government,
Out of
not
government.
governance.
Okay.
Out of government.
So now people rejected the Rajapaksas at one point. During the Aragale, we saw that unfolding. There were slogans against the Rajapaksas, but now it seems that the people themselves have forgotten. Namal Rajapaksa is the national organizer of the Sri Lanka Pujana Pyramid. He was appointed recently. What is happening?
Well,
Are we going to witness something like in the Philippines again?
Well, let's hope not. Let's hope not. And let's hope that those people who are allegedly guilty of pilfering the public coffers are caught, indicted, and prosecuted. But the problem here is this. Yes, Namal Rajapaksa is around, and he may well become president in 10 years' time or whatever it is. But the question...
So you're saying that he may become the president of the country?
He could become the president of this country 10 years from now. I'm not giving a prediction here. I'm not Nostradamus. But it could happen, as it happened with Bong Bong. No, but the issue here is that the people have to be vigilant. They can't, do something and then forget about it. Mm-hmm. I mean, with regard to the Aragale, what happened? The middle class deserted the Aragale. A large number of members who went and protested and spent time in the Aragale at Gaulface are now either abroad or trying to find ways of getting a visa or trying to find ways of getting a job to go abroad. Mm-hmm. So the whole narrative with regard to the Aragale was allowed to be changed by the new government.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pakis Saramuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives. I now move my attention towards Sankita Gunaratna, Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. Sankita, Dr. Sarah spoke about the role of the civil society. What do you think the role of the people should be, the public should be? At a time we're talking about an election, we're still talking about corruption, we're back to square one again, unfortunately. What's the role of the public?
I think the most important critical issue right now is about voting right and rejecting people that you find to be unfit. That means looking at asset declarations of candidates. That means rejecting people who have criminal records or allegations of criminality, allegations of abuse of public resources, who spend their campaign finances on vote buying, who basically abuse power to thieve their way into power. So the importance of the vote, especially at this election year, cannot be understated. Because if you look at the culmination of the entire Aragale, yes, the Rajapakshas were thrown out of government unceremoniously, but we ostensibly have the same government in place, right? So if we ever get to a point of elections, and we are at a point when we are struggling to even have elections, where elections are illegally and indefinitely postponed. So if an election is so hard fought, and we manage to get to the point of polls, I think we should appreciate the value of it a lot more than we have. We've taken it for granted over the years. So why we should also think about why the elections are being postponed so desperately. That is because the power of the elections are felt by those in power right now, because there was a tidal wave of protests that was unprecedented. So the politicians are taking the power of the people seriously enough to postpone elections. For us to be under the threat that elections, presidential elections might unconstitutionally not happen, that the parliamentary elections may not happen. That means to that extent, those in power are clinging on to power because there's no guarantee that they'll be re-elected.
Are you trying to say that elections will not be held this year?
Again, I'm not Nostradamus either, but there is the risk of that. If you look at precedent that's already been set, the local government elections have been illegally and indefinitely postponed. That is fact. So I don't have to predict this. There is certainly a possibility that this will illegally happen. So then the question is, if such a desperate attempt has been already made to delay elections, that in itself would tell you what the power of the vote is. So I think the most important thing for the people to keep in mind is to reject bad politicians and do your part. So you need to, I mean, we, all of us as citizens, and I'm not by any chance, in any sense preaching here, we all need to recognize what the legitimate mandate of a politician is, as Dr. Sara was saying.
I want to go back. I want to go back to the year 2020, Sankita, the parliamentary elections. If you look at it, the UNP was rejected by the people. They were considered as bad politicians. None of the members were elected by the people. They had one seat. That seat, fortunately or unfortunately, was occupied by Ranil Wickremesinghe, who is now the president. However, at least the people in Colombo and the urban areas are of the view that the president is doing a good job. There are no long queues anymore. There is no long 13-hour power cuts in the country. Everything is hunky-dory. The dollar is coming down. All this is in the right direction.
I think we should be careful about treating the people of Colombo as a monolith. Again, going back to the original point I was saying, there may be a few people very loudly saying that what the president is doing is right. That does not mean that the majority feel that way, and the only way we can find that out.
In the event there is an election, he may lose.
He may lose, he may win, we don't know, but what is crucial is that we put that to the test, going back to the point of election. So to your question of what should the people do,
so when people want a systemic change in 2022 from the Aragal layer, do you think the present government has been able to give them that?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because what the people wanted was a change in systems. So what change in systems are we seeing? What they were calling for?
But aren't we back to square one, Sankita? But we spoke about corruption in 2015. I remember individuals in the caliber of Dr. Sara were advocating for good governance. People in the caliber of Lassil De Silva spoke about good governance. Look at where we are today.
I absolutely agree with you.
About corruption 8 years down the line.
I absolutely agree with you, but we should also keep in mind that change, and this is in no way meant to be a defense of the current government or the 2015 government or any government, but change also takes place incrementally. So it is important for civil society and for people, especially in this kind of state where we don't have many options, where domestic remedies seem to be failing, to not lose hope and to keep pushing for that change and keep doing your part at elections, between elections, as an active citizen, to push towards that change. So certainly we don't have an ideal situation, we have a desperate situation, which makes our role all the more important.
Very unfortunate, Sankita, very unfortunate that we are in this situation again, and we are talking about good governance and the need for creating an anti-corruption free country, you know. Very unfortunate. So I open the floor for questions from our journalists. On my immediate right is Niresh Eliathambi, and on my immediate left is Nadeem Majid. Nadeem, shall we switch to Niresh, and let's get the ball rolling with Niresh today.
Thank you, Shamir. A very wise man once told me, if you want to root out corruption, follow the money. Now, there's a lot of talk about corruption, about laws, about system change, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of following the money. So, Sankita, let me put this rather simple question to you. We're talking about billions, if not trillions, which have been looted. Nobody knows how much. Where is this money going? Is it in Sri Lanka? Is it going overseas? How is it getting there? Do politicians sort of carry gunny bags of money across Bandaranaike International Airport and are not stopped and land somewhere else and they're let in? Or is it going through the banking system? How does this happen?
So over time, let me start with 2017. In 2017, there was something called the Global Forum on Asset Recovery, hosted by the US and the UK governments, where they brought together countries where assets that have gone from Sri Lanka and a few other countries have ended up, and they brought together those authorities with the authorities of Sri Lanka. At the end of that conference, so what the purpose of the conference was for those authorities to discuss this kind of asset flight cases of following the money, to literally to do what you wanted us to discuss, to follow the money in rooms through bilateral and trilateral or multilateral meetings. So at the end of that, our then Attorney General announced that 43 cases, asset recovery cases, had been discussed during just that conference of less than 5 days. But by now, we don't have an inkling of what happened to those cases. I'm told that about 11 of those cases went to the stage of even requesting formal mutual legal assistance from those destination countries, whichever the countries were. But we have no idea why progress on these cases stalled. But what we can see is that it has certainly stalled. There is no public record of what these cases were. And when you look at the Aragale and the call of the people for asset recovery, that's literally what was happening at that point of time, but nothing has moved. So for asset recovery to happen, there has to be political will. To your question of how is money leaving the country, it is through the banking system, where private banks, state banks fail to report suspicious transactions. It is literally also through these gunny bags. We're told that it even happens through the diplomatic service sometimes, where they have a level of impunity when being checked at airports. So this kind of thing happens in through enablers. If you look at the Pandora Papers, the Paradise Papers, the leaks happened through financial advisors, persons who should be actually the guardians of the system, turning in the opposite direction and providing financial advisory services, audit advisory, tax advisory, legal advisory services to the corrupt people of the world, so that they can arrange their affairs to avoid regulatory systems. So that is how money gets stolen.
So Dharanath, we're speaking about the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, which is in partnership between the World Bank Group and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, that supports international efforts to end safe havens for corrupt funds. Why aren't we able to tap the STAR program of the World Bank to bring those money back, which has been stolen?
We have, I think, to an extent made an attempt, at least it is as a recommendation on the IMF governance report. What Sankita exactly mentioned, still in our system, it is very difficult to detect some of the suspicion transactions. So that's why if you look at the IMF governance diagnosis report, that anti-corruption and money laundering has given a separate section. So that's important, but unfortunately, if you recall, we were also in the grey list for a long time under this anti-corruption and money laundering, or like I think if I remember right,
FATF, the Financial Action Task Force.
FATF. And then, of course, that's why I said there's also a policy element. If you recall, during that time, at the height of the crisis, the government said at that point, because we had a forex shortage, that no questions asked, you can bring your money and deposit in banks if you even have dollars. And at that point, there was that risk that we were about to go back to that grey list because of the bad...
even blacklist.
Exactly.
But then the problem is, even with the the Stolen Asset Recovery Program, right? Even bodies like the OECD have acknowledged that this hasn't been broadly successful. That of the estimated 20 to 40 billion dollars that are stolen from developing countries annually, I think the figure was between 2010 and 15, if I'm not mistaken, the total that countries had managed to recover was about $150 million or something. This is out of 20 to 40 billion estimated to have been stolen from different countries, right? So even when the IMF makes these recommendations, like or you should join up with STAR, doesn't that sound like lip service?
In a way,
do you actually end up achieving anything? Because you're allocating resources now, right? So you're going to spend on the commissions of inquiry or on the Aegis department to pay people salaries to work with STAR. to get money, and then there's a very real potential that you'll get nothing back.
No, to an extent, Nadeem, I agree. It is just as a recommendation, and I'm sure there are multiple recommendations that has come in various reports, and we all know that. And that's where I think, coming back to that question, the importance of civil society, and that's why we need to push those reforms and get it done. And we all know the delays in the judiciary system and the loopholes in the legal system is basically not, even if we really want to bring down those assets, it is very difficult given the current legal
Without
system.
Any serious will domestically.
Absolutely. And also, yes.
So, Sankita, I was going to ask this question from Lasil, but as the anti-corruption watchdog, I'm going to ask you this question. Do you feel that, whenever we speak of incidents of corruption, especially acts of grand corruption, whether the bond scam or the cases that Presifac was looking into, the go-to response by the executive and sometimes even by Parliament is either to have a select committee or Presidential Commission of Inquiry. Do you feel that, regardless of what the stated intention is, do you feel that the intended purpose of these commissions and select committees at the end of the day is obfuscation?
I think you have a very good case to say so. Because if the authorities that are already in place were empowered, were given the level of independence required to carry out their duties, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to set up additional mechanisms that don't have the power of law enforcement to do that. Having said that, we have seen that where law enforcement has failed continuously, these commissions in certain instances, the Political Victimization Commission being a notable exception, but there are notable exceptions to this also. Some of these commissions, the commissions of inquiry on disappearances, Presifac, they also have served a purpose of documenting incidents of corruption, and that in the backdrop of the failure of accountability frameworks, of the existing law enforcement frameworks, that does have some value because it documents incidents for posterity. And if I recall correctly, in 2018, I believe.
If you look at all of the series of commissions that we've had over even just the past decade or decade and a half, we can build our own sort of separate archive, corruption in Sri Lanka. Because there doesn't seem to be any action taken on it. Presifac had 34 cases, if I'm not mistaken.
37 or something.
Okay, 37 cases. And I think one of your recommendations was to strip Mahinda Rajapaksa of civic rights.
Actually, one, and to take a decision, if there were corrupt politicians, in general, to take a decision by Parliament so that there'll be certain controls, restrictions for them to get involved in politics again.
So same thing I asked. When you were paid by the Presidential Secretariat to be the secretary to this commission, do you feel that you wasted public money because you're invested all of the work that you've done, the millions of rupees for the I think 3-4 years that your commission was in operation?
So let me add to that.
Was there any benefit? Was there a net benefit to the public outside of having a life?
So there's a viewer also asking a very similar question. All these so-called commissions are a waste of taxpayers' money at the end?
Naturally, up to now, most of these commissions, because I was thrown out in that way, and if we were allowed to continue, and finally, after having submitted the reports, because our duty was to do the investigation.
The report was submitted on the 3rd of June 2018.
January.
January.
Naturally, most of these commissions, look at even East Sunday, most of these commissions, they have made wonderful recommendations. But the problem is, no action taken thereafter. That is not the fault of the public officers.
So where is the problem? Because if you look, the now president,
that's a very good question.
Then Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe said that Presifac is one of the most serious issues.
Yeah, that's a very good problem.
Now see, Sankita used the word stalled.
Yeah, now
but
Sankita,
car will stall.
This is the thing.
In the case of an investigation, it doesn't stall.
Yeah.
It is deliberately not even stalled, it's thrown into the waste paper basket.
Yeah. Now, who
has the power to do that?
This is it. I like to add one, my comments on what you raised from Sangeeta. Now, see, there was this discussion about this money going out, right? Remember, in 1953, we had an Exchange Control Act, which was very, very strong. In 2017, if I remember right, 7 of 2017, right? I mean, permitted all kinds of transactions. You could send money freely, all that, right? And Vijayadasa Rajapaksa, Justice Minister himself, on the floor of the House, if I remember right, and it was published in papers also, Island or something like that, it said, we also supported that. And there were about 56 billion rupees parked overseas. And they will take action to bring the money back. Up to now, they have not done anything. So, now look at China, such a strong country.
Mr. Lasser, let me ask this question. Okay, so there are these figures, right? Global estimate is $20 to $40 billion is being stolen from developing countries annually. You're saying that in Sri Lanka's case, there's about 56 billion rupees that has been parked overseas somewhere. Who is responsible? Where does the buck stop here? Is it the political authorities or law enforcement?
You know, I like to
Should
say...
we be going and protesting outside the Attorney General's department?
I like to say it this way. Now, up to 70s, there was no such problems, right? If there was any indiscipline or whatever, people would have been dealt with, especially public officers. And even with regard to politicians, it was somewhat okay. Now, after 70s, I would say after 78, the president is above the law, right? It is the president who runs the entire show. I would say it that way. It is the president who runs the entire show. Go to parliament, you can see what's happening in parliament, right? The speaker supposed to be somebody like a judge. But what happens?
So basically, by your assessment, the buck stopped with J.R. Jayawardena. We can't hold him accountable anymore, but he basically brought this on all of us.
Correct, yes. Now,
let the robber barons come.
Huh?
Yeah.
Let the robber barons come.
But I mean, there are incidents of abuse of power have been happening. There's a famous case against who was not even a minister at the time, involving a case of throwing acid, where a prime minister who would later go on to be stripped of his civic rights intervened to have this young UNP affiliated lawyer acquitted. So we know that instances of abuse of power in Sri Lanka are not restricted to post 78. They have been happening since 1948.
Yeah, it has happened, but not to this extent, because even in 1970 there were incidents like even in Jaffna, no action taken. I agree, to a great extent there were shortcomings even then. But the parliament, for all purposes, is responsible in my view, because they should be able to enact the kind of laws that are needed here to resolve these issues. So it's not happening. Now, go back again. With the 78 constitution, what happened? There was a monster created. The president takes care of the whole thing. And it is the president ultimately who decides what should be done in the country. So for all purposes in this country, all what I personally think is this, right? This system was changed in 1970s, having replaced a constitution where the rule of law is a thing, not,
Yeah, I get where you're going with this, Ms. Lasser, but I just want to ask Dr. Saranmuthu as well. Dr. Sara, you've worked on consultation. You were part of the consultation team for constitutional reforms. Or you were going public consultation?
That was on transitional justice.
Sorry, on transitional justice.
But yes, I was involved in
with constitutional reforms as well. You've been involved. So how effective a measure do you see constitutional reforms? As Lasser was talking about constitutional reform to fight corruption. Can we fight corruption through constitutional reforms?
No, not by it alone. But I think it is necessary, but not sufficient. As I said to you before, you have the institutions and the laws on one side, and you have the public and their culture on the other. And the problem that we are facing here is that we have laws. They're not properly implemented. Why? Because the people who are supposed to be implementing them are either politicized, partisan, corrupt.
Yeah.
You have to change that.
So where?
And
So on
it
the
has-
accountability question, is it? Do we like I asked? I mean, we were the people at the Argale were protesting outside the symbols of political power, right? The parliament, the presidential secretariat. What I'm asking is, with regards to fighting corruption, should those protests be happening outside the symbols of bureaucratic power, like the AG's department, the police headquarters?
Well, I mean, all of those, all of them are symbols of democratic power. Parliament, the President's office, the Prime Minister's office, the AG's department, all of that. If you're going to have an Attorney General, for example, who defends the government and is also the chief prosecutor, it's an open conflict of interest. That has to change. Those changes can only come if the overarching law of the land creates a framework which allows for transparency and accountability and all the other things with regard to national reconciliation as well. You know, but just one point that it's in a sense a question to Mr. Tulasa. You know, I don't think the Argale would have happened if not for social media. Yeah, the success of the Argale, I think, is largely because of social media. When you all came up with recommendations that, like, Mahinda Rajapaksa should be stripped of his civic rights, etc., did you all have a website? Did you all put this up there? Did you tell the general public of Sri Lanka that these are your recommendations?
Our duty was to recommend it to the president because we have to submit the report there, right? So on that basis, we have done that. I mean, reported to the president. Unfortunately, nothing has happened.
Oh, but
thereafter.
the Prime Minister announced, then Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe announced it at an election
But I
rally.
think that's the thing.
That was one of the
In the future, if we have any commissions, they must be allowed to have that conversation with the public of Sri Lanka in terms of transparency and accountability, and not just to the president, because as we've said, the president sits on this apex of power. He appoints secretaries to ministries. He has an AG who is totally politicized and a parliament who is effectively a rubber stamp of some sort.
So, Dr. Sarab, a question from one of our viewers. Aren't these asset declaration forms just an academic exercise? It may be appropriate in a very developed world where all institutions are connected through technology and a culture of zero tolerance to corruption. But in Sri Lanka, politicians can get the commissions in corrupt jurisdictions in Africa and Asia and channel them to assets in developed countries through shell companies. So, don't you think that asset declaration forms at the end of the day is just an academic exercise?
Well, it will not succeed in full, but it may well succeed in part. I was talking to a politician, a high-up politician in one of the political parties, and I said, why haven't you come up with your asset declarations? And they said, oh, it's a waste of time, because asset declarations are meaningless. Because we also know that people have received tons of cash in brown paper bags. And it's been going on ever since 1948. You know, so you're never going to get the full picture, but you will get some part of it. It is incremental progress, unfortunately. It's not going to happen overnight.
Sankita, just on that question of not just on asset declarations, but broadly, TISL along with several other civil society groups was working with the government on the Open Government Partnership, starting from 2016 or 17, I believe, through to, well, minus the gap where Gotabaya Rajapaksa was president, and then again now. You all recently decided to withdraw. The civil society coalition withdrew from that program, citing the government's, the passage of the Online Safety Act and the work that was being done on the Counterterrorism Act. The grounds, do you feel that you have weakened civil society's position in your ability to influence government policy by withdrawing from that program?
That's a very good question, Nadeem. And these were certainly considerations when that decision was being made. So for our viewers, the Open Government Partnership is a forum where government and civil society commit to working together towards achieving transparency, accountability and public participation in certain prioritized sectors like health or education.
And digitization of asset declarations was amongst those commitments that you all made.
Yes, but if you're speaking about the digitization of asset declarations, getting that bill passed was part of the 2019 to 2021 National Action Plan of the Open Government Partnership, and it's already now law and is supposed to be implemented also. But on the larger question that you ask, the risk with civil society when we engaged on the Open Government Partnership process, we as civil society had a frank conversation even with the officials of the Presidential Secretariat engaging on this, and we made our terms clear that...
And what was their response?
The response was positive in the sense that they wanted to engage with goodwill. The public officials that engaged quite proactively with the civil society groups there, but civil society made its position clear that we are consciously engaging with the state in a context of civic repression. So we started engaging at the end of last year, November, December last year, when civic repression was starting off, was strong. There were conversations about the Online Safety Act, but it hadn't come to fruition. There was still
But who did you meet at the
protests
Presidential
happening.
Secretariat, Sankita?
There were additional secretaries, administrative officials working with, taking the lead there at the Presidential
But they
Secretariat.
can't take decisions, can they?
Yes, so it is at the point when the National Action Plan was about to receive cabinet approval, because we needed to bridge that gap between dealing with public officials to taking into consideration the larger context within which we were operating, that we found ourselves unable to proceed, because we were still working with a government that was proceeding with civic repression, proceeding with the Online Safety Act that was protested to by the people, that was proceeding with a Anti-Terrorism Act version 2 that had gone through various waves of protest, that was more draconian, that was pitched to be more draconian than the existing people.
Well, let me
Which
actually
is
ask you,
why
I'm
we
trying
had
to think of a time in Sri Lanka where there hasn't been civic repression.
Sorry?
I'm trying to think of a time in Sri Lanka where there hasn't been civic
Well, okay, it's a question of a difference of degrees or a difference of kind.
Yeah.
But, the question about, who did you engage with at the presidential sector? I mean, we have an executive presidency which is all-powerful.
Yeah.
It is particularly powerful at this present moment where all decisions are made in the presidential secretariat and they're made by one person. Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, the president of Sri Lanka. All those people in that secretariat, they don't make decisions. We all know that. They carry out orders. So, if you want anything done, you have to go to the president. And I suppose there are only 24 hours in a day and he can't see everyone all the time.
Yeah. But all these meetings does not make any sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you might take whatever it is to the president, and if he has the time, he might look at it.
So that's a question for you. Cabinet recently approved contracts related to leasing 4 aircrafts to Sri Lankan Airlines at a monthly cost of approximately $725,000 US. How can this kind of expenditure be justified when the airline hasn't turned a profit for an extended period? Shouldn't there be downsizing operations until a suitable investor is found?
Absolutely. I think this doesn't make any sense, and that's why, Shamir, I'm going to my first initial remarks. That policy element or the system element is paramount important, because on state-owned enterprises, that's a vehicle for corruption, and we all know during election times how this finance is being managed because of those state assets. Rather than running it through the line ministries, it's convenient to run it through state-owned enterprises. And on corruption, those are the vehicles for corruption. On your previous point on president, the executive presidency, that's why now the challenge is, in particular, the things are very severe when president is also the Minister of Finance, because that's why we say it is not regarding this president, it across every time.
From
when the president is the finance minister, it's nearly impossible job to do on one side. On the other side, it opens a lot of room for corruption, because you are basically the president, you are appointing the central bank governor, you are basically appointing most of the senior people, and the power is centralized, and that is not a workable solution. And that's why it also dilutes the entire strength of the financial system, because we all know when the president is especially willing to run for a second term, finance minister's job is a very unpopular job. You have to cut down the expenditure, you have to increase the revenue. I mean, both are very unpopular. And when you are planning to run for a popular job with that unpopular portfolio in your hand, it doesn't go well. So that's the other challenge, and we saw the repercussions of that, how things have happened. So on SOEs, definitely, I think not only Sri Lankan Airlines, I think there are multiple cases how these things have happened, and mainly the procurement at SOEs is another way channel that of course this corruption takes place. We know the Airbus case, what has happened. So those two elements has to go hand in hand, and that's why the speediness of the judiciary system is very important. I think all those regulations are important, but also the digitization of that legal system is also at the same time important, because otherwise we all know what politicians does. They basically skip 3 hearings, and when you do it for like 2 years, there will be a new government, and that opens for another year.
So that's another question, if you don't mind, Niresh. The President at a meeting with the BOI today mentioned that approvals for investment will be done by one division, and if there is a delay, the Minister has the authority to either approve or disapprove. Won't this lead to severe corruption?
Absolutely. This is the discretionary power. In anything, when you have the discretionary power under one person, that basically leads for corruption. I think a classic case is NMRA. I think that's why I say, especially, we cannot implement some of the first world solutions to this culture and this setup. It doesn't mean that we have to completely wipe out those solutions, but I think on the NMRA, now the former health minister is not actually in jail at the hospital, but actually a reasonable solution could have been, I think the countries like Singapore and US, they have a process to approve drugs. So any drug which is approved in Singapore, if it's implemented here, that's the case is done. But now you have set up a separate unit to approve the drugs to Sri Lanka, and you know what, we all know what has happened. The data has been deleted, and then there's another, and then people are smuggling different types of drugs. But it could have been a better solution without setting up that. I'm not saying to completely dismantle NMRMA, but when you have a better system in a different country which you can easily replicate here, if that's approved there, it's approved here. So then if you want to really get something done, you cannot influence the Singapore system. So I think those solutions is unfortunately what we have to look at now, rather than trying to, I mean, it is important that we set up our system, but I think we also have to look at the other options at the same time.
You want to
yeah, actually we had very good systems, you know, say Senaka Bibile. Those principles were ultimately laid down, and it was all practiced here, and system was functioning so very well. Actually, my problem is, you know, the 3 pillars of justice, temple of justice, they say, the executive, the judiciary and the legislature, right, should not be undermined. What has really happened here is that basically we need to understand that, right? Executive has a role of its own, and that should be done independently by them, which they did even with regard to NMRA. That was a computerized system. They did it, spent some...
So Mr. Lasser, you said it should not be undermined. Who has undermined it?
No, undermined by the biggest man in the country.
The
right?
executive, basically.
No, and the cabinet.
Why are you pointing the finger at Ranil Wickremesinghe?
No, I'm not pointing a finger at Ranil Wickremesinghe. I'm pointing a finger at about the system. Right? System needs to be corrected.
Will you point the finger at Maithripala Sirisena?
I will point a system, if there's a mistake, I will definitely...
You are saying executive level, you have to be practical.
No.
There has to be someone responsible at the end
you
of the day. Why are you not answering the question?
This is why I said that the 3 pillars we have, right?
So when you say executive, President Ranil Wickremesinghe.
Now let me say it this way first.
When you say executive,
yeah, no, not only the president. Now the entire public service comes under the president, right? The executive. Right?
So ultimately Ranil Wickremesinghe.
Naturally, because he is the head.
So you can say that. No, sir. Why are you scared?
No, I'm not scared. I was not. I was never reluctant to say it. I said specifically the president, right? But I am trying.
Ranil Wickremesinghe.
I mean, it is he is the president now. I'm talking about the presidency from 1970.
Whoever the president is, he has to be responsible.
In the executive, let me say it clearly. Here in this country, we were fully well aware there were 3 pillars, right? The executive, the judiciary,
that. Okay, understood.
Legislature, right? So these 3 institutions has to be given all the independence to work out their programs, duties, all that independently, right? Now, what has happened here, the biggest problem, now he says about this NMRA, right? Who is responsible? The minister. Now, minister is in remand custody. There are allegations against them also because whatever said and done, all those decisions were taken by the cabinet, and the whole responsibility goes collectively for all of them. We have to understand all that.
I was asking the entire cabinet has to be played by.
Yeah, and the entire cabinet is responsible when... No.
Not just the health minister.
No,
You're saying the entire cabinet
no.
should have been indicted.
No, and when a cabinet paper is approved by the cabinet of ministers, right, collectively, Article 42 of the Constitution, it has to be the cabinet of ministers, right?
So basically what you're saying is this collective responsibility.
They are all responsible.
They're all responsible.
For all the
Should have all been
mistakes,
indicted.
for all the omissions, whatever inaction or action, all that, right? They are responsible. Unfortunately, it does not now ultimately end up with them because they know how to sort of get away from all that. So what I am trying to tell you, we have to understand how the system was broken down. Actually now, like what he said, all the appointments are made by the president. Article 52(1) says the secretary shall be appointed by the president, right? When the secretary is appointed by the president, ultimately he has to work under the dictates of the president, right? And the other thing is 52(2) specifically says that he is under the supervision and instructions of the minister. So this system has eventually broken down the concept of three-pillared system. And having broken it down, what eventually has happened, everybody ultimately interferes with the purchasers, whatever, if ever it is a tender or whatever, right? Now, those days under Article 7, before 1970, the permanent secretaries, they took the responsibility. They are directly answerable to Parliament through the minister to the Public Accounts Committee. Right? When they go to the Public Accounts Committee, if they have done a mistake those days, they'll be dealt with. What happens now?
Lasse, I find it very interesting because
you have to understand that I'm trying to tell you the big picture. You have to understand the big picture.
A lot of people paint this rosy picture of what the CCS was like and how pre-1978 or pre-Republican constitution, basically Sri Lanka was functioning beautifully, our bureaucrats had the highest standards of integrity, our politicians were the greatest. I wasn't around at that time. But the more I actually read about that time as well, the picture doesn't seem very rosy to me at all.
Which I always have it with me, Lord Atkin, Toronto Corporation versus York Corporation. This was a case decided in 1938, which referred to the three organs of the government, namely the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, as the three pillars in the temple of justice that are not to be undermined. What was meant by this statement was that the three pillars should have equal but independent power to keep each other in check. So, unfortunately, even the judiciary can't interfere and take a decision because there is somebody over them, which should not happen. So you have to understand where it has gone wrong.
Right.
What is important is, in 78, they have brought a system where everything was brought under the president. Actually, this is the problem in the country.
I'm getting a lot of questions and I want to try and take them as much as possible. So this question is for Dr. Sarra. Since you spoke about political culture, when there are political parties based solely for the purpose of specific communities of the society, how does this help to eradicate corruption? Because people from those segments usually vote for their parties based on their needs prioritized, and even the ministers from those parties crossing over after an election just for portfolios to be able to help their community. As long as they cross over, the culture exists to facilitate the majority in the parliament. How can we fight corruption in situations like this?
Well, we have to take a decision in Sri Lanka as to whether we are going to be a society that believes that we have unity on the basis of diversity. And if that's the case, then we have to also consider as to whether we will allow political parties and formations to form under on religious grounds or on ethnic grounds. But the issue here is this: whether they are Sinhala, Buddhist, Christian, Tamil, whatever it is, they are citizens of Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And if they have the virtues of integrity, of decency, of transparency, of being accountable, if they have a notion of public service, does it matter where they come from? You know, that's the key thing, is that we need to have citizens in this country who are of that description that I gave you, or who are striving towards that or approximate that, and we, the rest of us, have to be the ultimate check and balance.
Definitely.
We have to be the ultimate check and balance. You know, if we go to sleep, I mean, I've said this before so many times, you know, every 5 years we go buy a ticket to a bizarre play which we call Government and Governance in this country, go home and criticize it and all of that, and come back another 5 years and do the same damn thing. We can't be an audience. We have to be part of the play, as it were. You know, so we have to, you know, we can't sort of just point at politicians and sort of think of them as a different breed and think of that, you know, they have to come up with a plan to help us and save us. We have to be part of it.
So, Randim, I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot of questions. I need to take them as much as possible because the WhatsApp messages are loaded with questions. Now, this one is for Dharanath. Dharanath, did a bond scam took place in this country in 2015?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
In fact, I have mentioned it multiple times, for the economic crisis, there were multiple shocks since 2015, and the beginning was the bond scam, and 2016-17 there was the drought, exactly, and similar things happened. But I think I have a different view to Mr. Lasil on one point. I think we are missing the bigger picture here, that is on the state capacity, because you know, we are finding it difficult to get one minister responsible for one corruption case, and it is not practical that we are thinking of getting all the cabinet behind the bars. It's like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. It is not going to happen. That's not practical. That's why I say, especially in a context where the state capacity is weak, and that's one of the main criticisms I have also for the IMF recommendations, because you have nice recommendations, and we all know when we go to state departments, their capacity, you really do not have the capacity. So there's no point again coming back and saying this hasn't been implemented. We know they do not have the capacity, and so to do that, what we need to do is to, I go back to my initial point, you have to reduce the discretionary power and allow that discretionary power to minimize, so then the system basically works. And just because trying to strengthen it doesn't mean that we should not bring laws. We have to, but it doesn't, by just bringing the laws and without execution, this problem will not go away. On the other side, on the corruption front, again on those 1977 and all that, I think definitely the executive president is a bad move, but again, on the current account and all that, for business to operate, those reforms has to take place. I mean, look at how many investments, how many Sri Lankan businesses has gone abroad.
So there was a follow-up question to that question as well.
Okay, sorry, I went slightly.
So you said that there was a bond scam in 2015. Is it the governor of the central bank who is responsible, or the minister, then prime minister, who was in charge of the central bank of the country?
I think all three were responsible, because the appointment process, we all know how it took place. So there was a sequence of the appointing process, and then there was a sequence of how that was attempted to cover up. So I think all are responsible, because if you are trying to cover up one of the scams, you are equally responsible as same as the scam. So I think everyone is responsible.
And one more. Now see, I fully agree with Dharanath. Actually, it should definitely be under the Minister of Finance, but it was shifted.
The Minister of Economic Planning.
Economic and Planning, right? So you can't do all that to suit your individual whatever.
The problem is now the governor is usually appointed by the president. Now, Maithripala Sirisena went on to say that he told Ranil Wickremesinghe not to appoint Arjun Mahendra. Arjun Mahendra was appointed by Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe.
No, because
I know he washed his hands.
No, there was a
in a
long
situation like
delay. There was a little delay in making the appointment, right? I mean, it's on record to say you can't. It's not an excuse, right? I mean, if he were the right president, he would have said no, I can't, because he's not he's a dual citizen, right? But ultimately,
he was not the right president.
I mean, yeah, I would say, right? Now, by removal,
we have made so many mistakes to that. Now, 2015, Maithripala Sirisena was appointed. That's a mistake. 2019, Gotabaya Rajapaksa was appointed.
This
then
again.
You said I wanted to wait and see what he does.
No, because we have to respect.
Was also investigating.
We have to respect the people.
Now, who are you supporting, Nasir?
No, we are supporting a new move, because we are sick of all these 225, and we have understood that they have failed and they have ultimately bankrupted the whole country.
So, what is the alternative? You have always had a political ideology in front of you, Nasir.
Yeah, actually,
2015 you had Maithripala Sirisena, 2019 you had myself. 2024, who do you have? Tell me.
2024, we would like to have our own program. We will be definitely issuing.
So, there is a program called Driving Systemic Change, Essential Role and the Roadmap for a 5-Pillar Governance Framework.
Yes.
Why do I get the feeling that this is also just limited to 23 pages?
No, now you will have to go through and then understand what it is.
I have gone through this. That's what I'm asking you.
Now, even Dhananath said, Dhananath said, there is a system how you govern the country, right? Basically, we will say our board of directors, if it's a company, right? Our board of directors is the cabinet of ministers, right? And it's a collective responsibility based on the Westminster system. Everybody should take the responsibility, because you can't simply allow or approve a proposal just because a minister wants it, right? They have to take the entire responsibility if it was faulty. So naturally, most of the decisions that they have taken over the years are wrong. That's why we have ultimately ended up having, ultimately can't.
So in this 23-page document, in your concluding remarks, you also go on to say, direct parliamentary oversight is crucial for maintaining state integrity, ensuring transparency and promoting good governance.
Correct.
Am I correct?
You're right,
That's from this.
Now,
when you have people like Rohit Abeyegudumardana appointed to as the co-op committee chairman, you tell me, how does this work now?
Did we do that? Unfortunately, people have this is the problem. You have to understand. I'm sorry.
But Mr. Lassin, this is the problem, right? What Shamir highlights is that you can lay out a framework as much as you want.
No,
but
Shamir is correct. Shamir is asking me, people have elected. I am asking you, have the people, do they have any choice, right, to nominate their candidates who are at least good? Right now, look at Lalita Atulath Look at Lalita Atulath Mudali in '77. He was the Minister of Trade and Shipping. End of the day, recently Rohit Abeyegudumardana was the Minister of Shipping. Right? Unfortunately, the capacity. Look at the big problem what you have. End of the day, what has happened here in your country?
You are expecting that parliament to play the role of maintaining state integrity, ensuring transparency, and promoting good governance. I'm talking from your
right now go to page 5. We have given 5-pillar governance system. Right? We say constitution. We can say the legislature, the executive, judiciary, independent commissions. Because what is
for those who are watching this show tonight, what if they say, this is also a waste of money?
No. We will definitely explain the whole thing to the people, because within the next couple of weeks, right, we want to tell the country our biggest problem, nobody respects the constitution. If you have a constitution, you are supposed to, because you have given an oath, and you are supposed to follow and respect the constitution, right? It's always followed in the breach, almost every day, I would say.
Right.
So we are recommending the constitution, because even in other countries we have studied carefully what has really gone wrong even in other countries, right? Whether it is in America, I mean, it's a flawed democracy now, they say, right? Because when they implement their decisions, the politicians have, manipulated those decisions. Actually, there shouldn't be room left for the politicians to manipulate. For that matter, even the public officers.
So Sankita, just switching to you very quickly, can't we have a country-centric and specific manifesto instead of a political manifesto moving forward?
Ideally we should, but a big problem that we have is that we don't have policy continuity between governments. And one of the things that Mr. De Silva was referring to, the fact that we have politicized ministries, secretaries of ministries being appointed by the president, means that the public service at its very helm is amenable to political interference, which makes policy continuity very, very different. But, taking on from your question a little bit more, I want to make this point. We all talk about accountability, right? The entire country is thirsty for blood. Everyone is looking for people to be held criminally accountable. But even if all these people we are talking about through generations are held accountable and put behind bars in an ideal situation, would corruption in this country stop? It will not. It will not, because the system itself, as Dhananath was referring to, the system itself is geared to corrupt whoever occupies these positions. So irrespective, we need accountability. We are pushing for accountability. We are engaging in litigation, for example, because that is a recourse that civil society has had to advert to.
Let me get this right, Sankita. Are you trying to say that even if we get rid of the corrupt politicians from this parliament now, corruption will not end in the country?
It will not. That is where what you were referring to, systemic change, reform needs to take place. You know about the civil society governance diagnostic, the IMF's governance diagnostic, all of it pushes for, so that is what the state has agreed to. That's the extent that the country has gone to. All of that pushes for reform, and that's the IMF's governance diagnostic talks about enacting laws. We talk about implementing laws, enforcing laws. So it's really, really important for us to push for the reform agenda parallel to the push for accountability, because we shouldn't kid ourselves, we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that just accountability is going to rid the country of corruption.
But how does a member of the public bring pressure to bear on an elected person once the election is done and dusted? Because in Sri Lanka, you cannot walk up to the door of your member of parliament and knock on it. You're not going to get in. So the ideal situation would be that local government representatives who would be more approachable should be there. However, we don't have local government anymore. So how in the world is the public supposed to bring this pressure to bear on the elected representatives?
So anti-corruption,
we should have the right to recall.
That's it. We have a system here proposed, recalling system, right? There are ways and means. Actually, most of the problems that are there in the country can be resolved. There is no two words about it. Now, you said corruption cannot be eliminated. Now, there are countries where they say zero tolerance for corruption, right? And in this country, the corruption is growing. It has become a cancer. Why? No action can be taken against the politicians. That's what I said, right? Government of the politician, by the politicians, for the politicians. Those days it was different. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. Why? The separation of powers. Ultimately it was the judiciary which decided on whatever irregularities, punished. So what we want here is the system. When you want the system right, how do you put the system right?
So now, based on what Sankita is saying, that even though we get rid of the current 225 members of parliament, whoever is going to be appointed will also be corrupt, it's quite dangerous. That's an alarming situation.
No, so that is why I say you have to do the institutional reform.
Yeah.
And you also have to do the political culture reform. And you have to look at the interplay, the dynamics between the two. Hopefully, out of that will come a less corrupt system. I don't think we can have a totally non-corrupt system, but it can be mitigated to a considerable extent. And some of the things that we have talked about, I think, are absolutely necessary. But it's not one or the other. The two have to go hand in hand.
So, Dr. Sarah, now we see politicians speaking about establishing a corruption-free country. We see such slogans being made by the NPP a lot in political fora as well as we speak. What is the alternative for the country at this very moment of time? We see the SLFP having agendas with regard to elections. We see the NPP, SJB, the UNP, SLPP having agendas in terms of the elections. What is the alternative that the people should look at when going to the polling booth this time around?
The conventional wisdom is, at the present moment, is that people are going to vote for a change. That they have given the two main parties power for the last 76 years. They've screwed the country up. We must go for a change. When you ask them what that change is, they're not looking at it. It's an act of desperation. So what I say is this, is that please consider what you are going to vote for. And the recent developments with regard to this television debate between the SJB leader and the NPP leader on what they would do when in government, I think is entirely to be welcomed, and I hope MTV might take it up, because people need to know what they are going to do. I mean, the NPP talks about anti-corruption. They haven't told us how they are going to get the money allegedly salted abroad. Right? They say they will probably then go after the money that is in Sri Lanka. But they are telling people that they will do anti-corruption. Once they come into office, if they don't act, their own supporters are going to turn around and sort of say, you're just like all the others. You know, so we need to know what are these plans.
But
We've moved beyond the slogans.
But we see slogans being made, but when we speak to individuals, now we had last week an NPP representative, and we asked him, tell us, how do you all intend to bring about change in the country's economy? What sort of conditions would you all discuss with the IMF? They don't have an answer. If you ask the SJB, they would say, we will renegotiate the terms with the IMF. How is it going to be done? No answer.
So then the people have to ask themselves the question, one lot doesn't have an answer, the other lot is the same, they also don't have an answer. So who do we vote for?
What is the alternative, Dr. Sarah?
The alternative is that you don't vote on the basis of faith, that you put pressure, and hopefully you all will come up and take this whole idea of the television debate, get it going, get the people more informed. The basic mechanism of choice and change in a formal democracy is elections. The electors need to be informed, and it is part and parcel of the Fourth Estate's duty and responsibility to inform them. And to inform them not with regard to fake speech or fake news or AI or whatever it is, but with regard to the certain principles of transparency and accountability that the media also has to adhere to. I mean, like, for example, there was a media report that said that, look, someone has been already arrested on the OSA. That damn thing, the machinery hasn't been set up. The other day they said that the president has said that there will be no elections until the IMF program is completed.
Misreporting.
Yeah.
Misreporting.
Misreporting.
I mean,
and so now everyone is saying, yes, are we going to have presidential elections? They are going to be abolished, or they are going to be got rid of.
Both
We have a
instances that you
government
refer to
that
came
doesn't
from the
even
same publication.
adhere to Supreme Court rulings. All of that kind of thing. Why the hell didn't they read their article properly? But you gave them the headline. We are a nation of headline readers, and we're getting misinformed.
So yesterday, Dhananath, in Parliament, we saw the passage of the banking amendment bill. it went without any contention. There was no debate. Parliamentarians who were supposed to debate these matters in Parliament were not present. People don't know what the contents of the bill is. What is going on, Dhanana?
And that's where again I come back to my same point. Of course, even if at the Parliament the capacity is not there, even the members are not interested to come and have the debate.
25 parliamentarians
Absolutely.
were not present.
Absolutely. So you can imagine what happens afterwards. So that's where it is, I think, where we have to come together. That's where I think the pressure needs to mount up in a gradual phase, or like in different phases, in different fronts, because that's the only thing, Shamir, that's going to change. Because when we question, when we bring the pressure, is only at least that inch of incremental change would happen. Because otherwise, even what we see today will not happen.
But can we have any hope in this 225?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. We definitely need new people, but it has to come through the democratic system. There has to be the elections. It has to be similar kind of people.
What kind of people do you think, Dhananath, Sri Lanka requires at this point of time? Because when we speak to people who have the knowledge, who have the capacity, they don't want to contest elections. They don't want to be even from the national list of a political party.
Can I just, drawing on what Dr. Sarah said, I'll rephrase that question that Shamir was asking. Dr. Sarah was saying, we need to have, like, amongst the public as well, we need to be voting for these values of transparency, look for integrity, people who are willing to be held accountable, etc. Do you feel that maybe as electors, we don't elect people with those values? Because in our day-to-day interaction, in our day-to-day businesses, we don't uphold those values. So the culture is not there amongst the polity, therefore you cannot expect it amongst the politicians.
No, absolutely. I think there was a recent piece by the former governor of the Indian Reserve Bank, Raghuram Rajan, and he basically has explained why this happens. And definitely there's a culture issue, because we all in a way have been beneficiaries.
I think he said something back when he was IMF chief economist, if I'm not mistaken. He said something similar regarding the cause of the 2008 financial crisis as well, right? That there was a cultural problem belying what caused
absolutely. So I think
financial crisis.
We all have been, many people who elect those politicians have been beneficiaries of these systems, and that's where the digitization and that removing that discretionary power comes to
so this is where I become kind of a nihilist, right? I oscillate between being optimistic and being just absolute nihilist. So when I think about it in this case, I'm like, okay, if we think about values, and if we can get people to care about values and vote for values, then we can have good people in parliament. But then I think we don't uphold these values ourselves in our day-to-day lives, so therefore we are not going to have good people in parliament.
No.
How do we
basically have a critical mass in parliament that uphold those values? You won't get everyone upholding the values, of course not.
And also, Nadeem, I would look at the framework mainly in voting, answering Shamir's question, because I don't think no one is bigger than the game, because you basically have to, because if we think that one magical person or that magical 225 will come and rescue, it won't happen. It is the framework, it's a guideline, it's the agreement, it is what's going to rescue us. Not one individual, not those 225. It is what we weave together. So that framework is I'm concerned at, and that framework would only be the solution for us. No individual person, no group, not a political party, nothing. It will be only be that system and that framework, and I think we have to feed into that system for making sure that the filtering and that voting system takes place in favor of protecting the system.
So, as I said before, I'm getting a lot of questions. I'm trying to select them very wisely because most of them have comments and references as well. So, referring to Sankita's statement about not having a corruption-free country ever, how about we bring some stringent laws for serious crimes like chopping off hands for stealing, like in Islamic law? Would that stop corruption taking place in the country?
Can I just say
I don't
that
think
hasn't
we are-
stopped corruption in countries that practice Sharia law anyway?
No, but
I don't think we're advocating
among
that.
the most corrupt in the world.
Actually,
Nadeem has
legally-
answered the question too.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So go ahead, please.
Yeah, just quickly to respond, more rules would help in a rule-following country. We are not a rule-following country. We have a new Anti-Corruption Act. We've had a Bribery Act. We've had a Commission to Investigate Allegations of Bribery or Corruption Act. We have a penal code which recognizes bribery and corruption as offences. We've had all of this, so more law is not what we need. What we need is serious attention to the issues of today. So that means ensuring that the polity is informed, that means voting correctly, that means getting the systems in place, that means reducing discretion at every single juncture. But as Dhananath was saying, it has to be weaved together, because we can't lay the blame or the responsibility for the issue of corruption with any one party. If you look at the anti-corruption infrastructure, each one of us and each sector has a role to play in defending against corruption. Investigative journalists, civil society, citizens, CORP, COPA, the Auditor General, Parliament, the judiciary. I can go on, the central bank, the FIU, the private banks, the public banks. All of them have a role to play, and
courts.
systems, the courts. I think I mentioned the judiciary. It doesn't get solved in one sweep of a wand. So we have to keep pushing for all of this. And in terms of the tools that we need to be in place, we need beneficial ownership registers that show any conflicts of interest, who really owns companies. We need asset declarations to be public so that voters can be informed before they vote. We need campaign finance laws, but we need campaign financing information being put out in public by the people receiving it and by the people giving campaign financing, like companies, like individuals. All of this. One of your viewers had mentioned that we don't have a system that can be integrated, but we have that in law now. So pushing for that. All of that has to happen.
So the problem is, Santa, we have laws in the country. Now let's talk about the
Exactly what I was
Anti-Corruption Act
saying.
that was
Enacted
recently. But the implementation is key at the end of the day, isn't it?
Absolutely agree, and that's why this kind of victory is hard fought. It has been years that we have fought for the public access to asset declarations. We have it in law now. The next fight is to ensure that CIABOC is resourced, to ensure that the appointments to CIABOC, the Director General, the Commission appointments are done properly, that we have visionary leadership.
Recently
that
we saw
technical
on the
objectives
issue of
are
like to
met.
add
CIABOC
one
being
figure.
resourced
Now
as well.
see,
Yeah.
Act number 9 of 2023 is the one that was recommended by the IMF. Even to date, right, now see about these big onions and all that, right? Such a lot of corruption taking place. Nothing will be stopped in this system. What I am trying to say, it reminded me during the course of the discussion, in Canada, maybe they have gone through the same problem. Look at our country. How many reports have been tabled in Parliament with regard to various omissions and commissions, all that, right? None of those have been actioned. Nobody now, even
But
central bank.
we are expecting those to be actioned by the very people.
No. Now see, when the Parliament submits a report to Parliament, now the committee investigated and tabled it in Parliament. Actually, the Parliament is supposed to send it to the Attorney General and for him to take it up with the court, send it to the judiciary and do the needful. But that has never happened for the last 30-40 years. I have been in Parliament for 37 years and I know after the 70s, nothing has been done. Most of those things under
Now, blessed, the COPE committee has been established in the country in the late 1970s.
Correct, yes.
Tell me one instance.
That's what I said.
One instance.
That's what I said. Now, see, look at the PAC. It was established.
It's a drama. You see
no. What I am trying to say,
officials coming and testifying. All that very good.
True. Now let me say it.
But what
now
has
see,
been done?
in Canada, what did they do? They appointed a commission, right? A public accounts commission. That's about all this. They are the ones who are taking legal action thereafter. So in our case also, we have to have something similar. We have to follow various other countries also. and try and see whether they could be planted here and push these things through. So what I'm trying to tell you, we have to understand what governance is, how you promote or how you stabilize the whole system effectively, deliver all that for the benefit of the people. Here, nothing happens. Ultimately, you don't know. You spoke
about sprats being caught and the sharks evading the net.
Yeah.
Recently, we saw a police sergeant sentenced to 4 years for accepting a bribe of 500 rupees.
Yeah.
But we don't hear stories of individuals who have swindled money, who have accepted bribes in millions.
In my case, I don't know whether this is correct, right? Can a public officer or can a man who was charged for murder, extortionist, be in parliament? So when those things happen, anything can happen in Sri Lanka. Let me say it that way, without naming.
I think he's since been acquitted, right?
No, acquitted. That again, let's stop it. Right.
Stop appeals.
No, I mean, he was once convicted for murder and sentenced to jail.
Yeah.
Right?
And then he was released on bail on appeal.
I think better leave it to the people to decide, right? So basically, my thinking is, if the kind of governance system that is there in this country,
that must decide,
you will never be able to serve the masses the way we think, right? This needs to be corrected. This needs to be turned upside down, probably, right? And they will never do that.
So, Dr. Sarah, I have another question from one of our viewers. Can Sri Lanka turn into a Swiss-style cabinet and rotating presidency? No single party gets control of the cabinet.
Very good. That's possible. That's a system change if that is the case.
If I had your telephone, I would send her or him the reply of what is it that you're willing to do to make sure that that happens.
Yeah. Do you think that the people in the parliament will ever do that?
But Dhananath said, Dr. Sarah, this time around at an election, we won't be looking at political parties per se. We'll be looking at individuals who can make a change, who will bring in that difference to the table. Don't you think this time around, at a general election in particular, it's going to be individual-centric rather than political party-centric?
Well, we've had the argument that we all have to work together on a reform agenda and that we can't expect a single individual, that we've gone now beyond the point of hoping for messiahs. So, in effect, we have to be the change that we want to be.
Definitely. You're right.
And it is us who have to come up with a reform agenda, with arguments for constitutional reform, and make sure that they are done. I mean, look, the Aragalaya, apart from anything else, people took power into their own hands. Maybe they didn't have a specific plan and all of that, but they did take power into their own hands. They stood their ground. They had at least a limited objective that they achieved. It can happen again.
It can happen again.
Yeah. And hopefully it'll happen better planned.
And if it was a reasonably good government, right, they won't, like what happened there, they won't allow that to sort of drag. It is a gentlemanly set of people we need in governance because,
I'll come back to you.
Please.
No, so you're saying, they have to have a proper plan to be implemented. They have to have a political program. And that is what the citizens of this country perhaps have to come around in the next election. And that is why I say we need to have a set of constitutional reform proposals, a set of economic reform proposals, and get the political parties to endorse those things in full or part and hold them to it.
Do you have any hope on these politicians, Dr. Saraf?
I live in hope.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I won't be sitting.
Definitely.
Just on that, one more question for Sankita actually. Sankita, you were talking earlier about the need to ensure that institutions like Siaboka are well resourced, that you have the right people being appointed there, that it's a multi-pronged sort of approach. When I look at it, it sort of appears to me like this Gordian knot You're not sure where to start, because even when you're talking in terms of resources, Siabok has been underspending its budget for many years by big amounts. So there's no, it seems that, okay, on the one part, there's a lack of will. So then maybe we fix it with your solution of getting the right people in. But getting the right people in involves getting the right people, the appointers, getting the right people into parliament, into the constitutional council, etc. And then it seems to just go full circle, you know, like the snake eating its own tail.
I agree.
So when I look at this Gordian knot, where do you start?
Yeah.
Or maybe what you do need at the end of the day is what many people ask for, is someone with a sword to come and smash it.
Exactly.
Can I add to the Gordian knot that you're referring to? One of the issues that Siabok has said is a problem that they have is that people don't come to them with evidence. Whistleblowers don't come to them, witnesses don't come to them. Therefore, they have difficulty prosecuting these large-scale corruption cases. And I'm no apologist for Siabok, but because of that, they are stuck in this situation of, by their account, not being able to prosecute.
I can think of many examples where people have gone with evidence where there hasn't been prosecution.
But isn't that the job of Siabok?
To investigate and find the evidence.
The public are not detectives. They can't be going behind and collecting all this evidence.
I agree, but I'm talking about witnesses.
The public to play the role of Sherlock Holmes.
I'm also talking about witnesses being able to participate in a court process. So part of evidence, part of investigation is producing witnesses before court, right? So witnesses need to be able to stand up in court and attest to certain facts. However, how can we also accept citizens to come forward and be witnesses in a system that is captured, in a system where they're not seeing progress? They're not protected and they're not seeing progress. So because Siabok doesn't prosecute, people don't come to Siabok. People don't come to Siabok because because Siabok doesn't prosecute. So I think an immediate short-term solution to this, and this is to Siabok, is to start communicating when they do something, which is rare, few and far between, but they need to start communicating better. They need to start also exercising their independence to the extent that is provided by law. We know in 2015 the constitutional amendment, the 19th amendment, afforded Siabok a new power to be able to carry out investigations of their own volition without waiting for a complaint to be made. In 2017, upon the RTI Act becoming operationalized, TISL requested information on how many times that power had been exercised, and there was an unashamed response of 0. We have this on document, it is on our website. So Siabok now, with the new law, has been given, I think it's section 55 to 59 of the Anti-Corruption Act of September 2023, has given them new powers, powers of surveillance, powers, to all kinds of powers, observation. So Siabok needs to start showing that they're using these things. We saw a recent account of a private sector employee being arrested for an instance of sexual bribery. Even that little bit has the possibility of changing public perception, leading to, ideally, witnesses, victims coming forward. I'm talking about a short-term and small, immediate solution, because we can't keep speaking concepts here.
When people in this country have any problems, they don't go to Siabok, they go to their local police station. Siabok is almost non-existent to most people in this country.
Absolutely.
I don't think even the people know where the location of Siabok is.
Absolutely. And the best way for Siabok to communicate its existence is to start taking action, not to go around. And I know Siabok is engaged in a prevention drive, but Siabok going and talking to people about preventing corruption or how citizens should stand up is a waste of money and a waste of time in this context. And it's out of touch with the appetite and the need of the moment.
But Dharanath, you spoke about electing people and there will be an agenda that will come into play. The question is, majority of voters are from rural areas. Can they decide who are the educated or best to be elected?
It's a difficult question to answer, to be honest, because the reality is, because of this cultural issue, they have been the beneficiaries of the politicians. So basically they would more
inclined towards
exactly towards
them.
inclining towards the political, who are the
Party.
political masters. But it doesn't mean we should also not undermine that the grassroots are, not they are fairly sharp because they understand what is happening. And but of course there are instances that they also go with the wave or the tide. But I think we should not underestimate also on their information
See, for an
cycles.
example, Dhananath, there was a parliamentarian who threw chilies in parliament. He was re-elected to parliament again.
He's not rural, he's urban.
Yeah, he's urban, but he was re-elected to parliament again by the people.
I mean, a lot of the miscreants you're referring to are actually from urban
now
centers.
See, in this country, they are doling out various things, right? The poverty is so bad. Whatever said and done, it is public money they are using in that way. So what is needed now? Up to 1970s, schools, they had a lot better facilities. Now there are vacancies for English teachers, maths teachers, right? All that. And they have reduced the educational whatever allocation. So in a situation like that, definitely it's going to be a big problem, because our politicians, for that matter, if we follow the Westminster system, we have to appoint people who can do that job, at least as legislators. Now see, there are people who don't understand what legislation is. Actually the blame should go to the party leaders, whether it is Mahinda Rajapaksa, whether it is Ranil Wickremesinghe, all of them, right? They are the people accordingly destroyed even parliament for that matter, right?
Yeah, Dr.
No, I mean, this whole question of whether the rural people will understand. I mean, two things. In India during the emergency, there was an election and Mrs. Gandhi was turfed out. The vast bulk of the Indian electorate would have been seen as illiterate or semi-literate. They wouldn't have got degrees. And if you look at the people who've got degrees, they're exactly the people who we say have screwed us up in style. The second point with regard to it is that, at CPA, at the Center for Policy Alternatives, we've done some surveys on the level of awareness of what the IMF program is all about. And the figures for the rural areas are surprising. They are not at all ignorant.
Yeah.
They are not ignorant. Not anymore.
Professor, just given your extensive sort of work over the years in this area, let me try and frame that question if I could. Do you feel that there's a culture, almost patronizing culture, amongst specifically Colombo elites when it comes to how we perceive so-called rural voters as either illiterate or uneducated?
Absolutely.
And that is one of the reasons why, because if you actually look at take post 2018 constitutional coup time, a lot of the miscreants in parliament, for example, they weren't sent there by rural voters, they were from urban centers.
Yeah.
Right?
There is a culture of patronage, which is reinforced by the culture of entitlement. And the two have given us this crisis of governance that we're deeply mired in at the present moment.
So there's a final question that I'm going to take from our viewers and also the two journalists. Referring to Lassell, why doesn't the Constitution specifically cite limitations on the basic qualifications to be considered when electing parliamentarians, like not having a criminal record, etc.? Isn't this a flaw in the Constitution?
Yeah, actually, now even in the history, like, there were people, trade union leaders who have been ultimately elected to parliament, right? So particularly in that sense, they may not have shut the doors for them. That's one reason. Other reason, of course, very correct. If they were murderers, if they were people who have definitely been criminals, right? They should be completely shut. So these things need to be done. There is no two words about it. But unfortunately, this is why we say new.
It's there in the law. It's clear.
No, so that's why we need reforms. That's why we need to change.
But if you are a convicted killer, a murderer, whatever it is, you can't become a member of parliament.
But there are individuals with
yes,
integrity being questioned.
But if you are a convicted criminal, that issue arises in the United States of America with regard to Donald Trump.
Right. So let's wrap up for the day. But before that, let's hear the final thoughts of our panelists tonight. So let's start off with Dhananath Fernando, CEO of Educara Institute. What is your message to the public This being an election year, Dharanath, people have to make decisive decisions right now. Crucial juncture the country's economy is facing. What do we do now?
We have to believe on the program, and there are key reforms that needs to be done on economic revival as well as on anti-corruption. State-owned enterprises reforms is mandatory. Also the trade reforms are mandatory. Also the reforms at the Sri Lanka customs is mandatory. Without those three, that also incentivizes, there's one side is corruption, the other side is economic growth. That framework is what we need to consider. Not any individual can rescue us. It's only the program and the process will take us out from this crisis. There is no other way out, and we have to trust that system.
Thank you very much, Dharanath Fernando, CEO of Advocate Institute. I now give attention towards Leslie De Silva, former Director of Administration, Parliament. What's your final thoughts, Leslie?
Actually, our country was on a very strong footing because it was education, health, all that. You know, in the early 30s, early 40s, we had a lot of problems, malnutrition, all that, right? All that was overcome. We were on the right track. Even after ending the war, our leaders were not in a position to understand how to settle those other issues that were there, reconciliation, maybe all that, right? Look at the biggest problem, debt. Why did we get into debt? Bad management. There was a law in 2003, fiscal management, right? Totally abused. When they wanted, they amended, re-amended, did all that. We ended up in bankruptcy. All what I say, you know, there is a odious debt. There is a World Bank decision. If the people have not benefited, right, such debt should be recovered from them. I don't know how we do that, but we have to work hard for it. We can't take the blame and we can't take the burden. That's about it. Let the society also think on those lines, you know.
Thank you very much, Leslie De Silva. I now move my attention towards Sankita Gunaratne, Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International, Sri Lanka.
I think it's a reiteration of what has been said so far, and a call to the people to not lose hope, because we saw protest happening on the streets in 2022, but now that protest has to move into the more formal spaces, because we don't have the luxury, honestly, of protesting every day. People have livelihoods, people have to make ends meet. This is a very difficult, dire economic situation that we're living in. But that call that was made by people, as Dr. Sara was referring to, needs to now be crystallized into actual forms of reform. And I think all the panelists here have come up with specific reforms that are needed. And then we need to solve the problem of corruption. We need to address it. And in order to do that, I think if we had to make a choice of whether we start at the top or start at the bottom, we have to vote correctly so that it can start at the top. Right? So that is also important. And then we as citizens, as Nadim was referring to, if we ourselves are part of the problem of corruption, we need to stop that now. We need to remove ourselves from being part of the problem and make corruption untenable at every juncture. So we have seen now the courts almost proving to be a battleground on any critical issue. On any critical issue, we are seeing people go to court, challenge it. So litigation is something citizens can engage in, and it can be any public-spirited individual that can go to court. We saw this on the Online Safety Act. I really took courage from the fact that people who were on the streets during the Aragalaya went to court, moving their protest to the formal spaces by petitioning the Supreme Court by way of a bill challenge when that bill was placed on the order paper of Parliament. So not giving up hope and making corruption untenable at every juncture, whether it is on a specific instance of corruption or when it comes to the polling booth, I think is what the citizens need to do and all of us need to do.
Thank you very much, Sankita. I now move my attention towards Dr. Pakeshwar Sarvamuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives.
I think there are two things that we have to consider here. One, I would say, is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. We have to recognize our responsibilities, and when we're voting, we really need to recognize what we're voting for and make sure that even if it's an act of desperation, it's an informed act of desperation. The second one is that there is no such thing as a quick fix. None of these things are going to happen overnight. But we must vote in a way that it puts us on the course of correction. Because quite frankly, I think we've lost 10 years already. If we come back to where we would have been 10 years ago, we still have 10 years more to catch up with. So we're talking about a situation of roughly 20 years to get out of it. Roughly 20 years to get out of it. And therefore, we are voting in an election which is decisive, not just in terms of the immediate circumstances, but in terms of the circumstances over the next decade as well. Because we've got a horrendous brain drain. We are talking about, in that 10 years' time, where something like 40% of the jobs are supposed to be AI related. Are we ready for that? No, we are not. And those people who've gone out, in 10 years' time, their parents will probably pass away and they won't be sending money back. We're an aging population. So we need to think about all of those things. I know it is very difficult for people and they have to act, well, they will act in desperation to alleviate their current circumstances. But we must, civil society, in terms of the organizations that constitute organized civil society, must give them enough information to be able to make informed decisions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pakiswar Saranmuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, Sankita Gunaratne, Attorney at Law, Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka, Lassil De Silva, former Director Administration Parliament as well as former Secretary of Presifac, Dhananath Fernando, CEO of Advocata Institute. Dhananath, I won't let you go yet. I would be failing in my duty if I don't ask you about the country's economy. Tell us in a nutshell, how do you view the country's economy at present?
Temporary stability is what we experience. It's not a permanent situation. Without the reforms, we are climbing on a very delicate line. A second 18th IMF program or a second debt restructuring is just around the corner if we do not do the necessary reforms, because we have to look at the debt restructuring also with economic growth, because your debt is being measured compared to your growth. So if you do not have the economic growth, definitely we are going for another debt restructuring. That would be a very difficult situation. As Dr. Sarah said, the first debt restructuring, basically we lost 10 years. So I need not to say what would happen in the second debt restructuring.
So I'm trying to say that not very quickly, that all this what we are witnessing right now is because there would be an election in the future and everything is being manipulated by the government in power.
I'm not saying everything is being manipulated. There are positive signs at the same time. The economy is pretty much stabilizing, but this stabilization, you cannot stay in the stabilization for a long time. It is like when you enter a job, you come for a salary, but you cannot stay in that salary till you retire. Basically, you have to gradually move up, because stability, that stability frame, that you cannot stay for a long time. That's why we need to shift the gears for growth. At the same time, there are manipulations also taking place for the election, but I'm not saying all the changes that we are seeing is because of our manipulation. The economy is definitely stabilizing, but I wanted to reiterate and highlight that the growth needs to coming in. That can only come with reforms, including what we discussed today, but of course there are more reforms are there that needs to take place outside the anti-corruption space. But corruption and governance is key, but at the same time to growth there are multiple other reforms that we need to do.
One more question, Dhananath. I'm going to let you go for sure this time. I know you don't have a crystal ball in front of you, but tell us, the rupee against the US dollar, where do you see it by the end of the month?
End of the month, very difficult to predict, to be honest, but with the Expo Lanka transaction, if the money flows in, the dollars flows in, there is likely that the rupee will appreciate again, but with the interest rates going again down and with people's consumption picking up, likely that there will be some level of depreciation at the same time in the long run. But in the short run, because people have burden with taxes and people are not spending, the construction has basically declined by about 50%. It's slowly picking up. So till then, I think I do not see, if the tourism and the remittances are flowing as usual, I do not see a reason why the rupee should depreciate. But at the moment, I think the central bank, it also depends on what the central bank is going to do, because they are also buying dollars from the market and building their reserves, so that will also cause the exchange rate in the coming few months.
Thank you very much, Dhananath Fernandes, CEO of Adhikara Institute. Thank you very much, Newsfirst.lk Consultant Director at Newsfirst. Thank you very much, Nadeem Majid. Thank you very much for those who sent in those pertinent questions. I'm very sorry if I didn't take most of them. That's because of time constraints, and I had to take the best questions to the panelists because we were picking their brains on our subject tonight, which is anti-corruption and the need for systemic change in Sri Lanka. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. Corruption is the enemy of development and of good governance. It must be got rid of. Both the government and the people at large must come together to achieve this national objective. Take care and good night.